Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of World of Tanks here with me, Gitbag the Great. Now in this episode we are going to be doing a very nice and simple episode of World of Tanks where we're just going to be looking at the T-54 over some admittedly rather shit replay of me playing with the tank. You see me here on Kharkov, putting some considerable hurt into a very unfortunate T-71 and a Tiger II there with my T-54. Now, the T-54 is one of the most feared and respected tanks in the entire game. On one hand, it used to be very powerful, almost powerful to the extent that it was overpowered. It used to have such a low profile on the pre-alpha version of World of Tanks released back in 2009 and 2010 that it was almost virtually impossible to hit, considering the coding of the game at the time was still very much simplified and still needed a lot of refining before it could be released. Keep in mind this was during the pre-alpha version of the game. So over time, Wargaming did come to sort of balance out the tank to some degree. However, keep in mind that the general theme of the Russian medium tanks on the line that the T-54 finds itself on is very much so a line of quick, hard, low-profile raiders with not particularly good hull armour, but excellent sort of excellently designed turret armour. In that the armour on their turrets isn't particularly thick, but at the same time it more than makes up for it by being very well designed. This is very much a big strength, particularly with the T-54. Probably the biggest strength of the T-54 is its armour and its low profile. The tank itself isn't particularly punchy in terms of firepower. The average damage of the gun is... Let me just give me a moment. Should have gotten the info for this up beforehand, but the T-54, the Tier 9, original Tier 9 Russian medium tank, can have a choice between 4 different guns. All of them are 100mm, but they're all varying in terms of their capabilities. The weakest is the 100mm D10T mod 1945, which you find on the Tier 8 T-44. That gun on the T-44 is actually quite a good gun, as is the 100mm LB1. The difference between the D10T mod 1945 and the LB1 is that the former has greater dispersion at 100 metres, long range time, but it does way less and it is considerably less expensive. It has the same damage value and the same penetration value with the APCR and high explosive. However, the LB1 does benefit itself by being slightly more accurate, slightly more higher firing rate, and also has 8mm more of penetration on its standard ammo on the LB1. The next gun you upgrade up to from that is the D-54, the 100mm D-54, which has a great penetration value on the standard ammo of 219, APCR is 330, and HE is 50. The damage of each of these ammo types respectively is 320, 320, and 420. So the damage is considerably heightened once you get to the Tier 9 100mm guns. It fires about 7.32 rounds a minute. Dispersion is the same as the D10T, and it aims at the same rate. Not to mention, it weighs considerably more, at almost 260 kilograms more. Of course, considering that it's a Tier 9 gun, it's also a lot more expensive. Same thing with the D10 T2S. This one is the same price as the D-54. It, however, aims 0.6 seconds quicker. It's also 0.04 meters more accurate at 100 meters. It has 0.04 meters less dispersion at 100 meters, and it also fires a slightly higher rate. So there is the benefit of that it's much more accurate and much higher firing. Well, not much, but to a small degree. The main thing to consider with this one, however, is that it's got a much lower penetration value. Its standard ammo is 18mm penetration less than the standard ammo on the D54, sorry. So therefore, you might just want to go for the D54 because it is a considerably more powerful gun. It's less accurate and it's considerably slower at aiming, but at the same time, that extra 18mm of penetration on standard ammo does serve you really well. It's a slightly more stable gun, but the D10T2S, to sell it a bit more, also I find has slightly better soft handling stats. The D54 in general is just more powerful and is more stable, but if you want a sort of a quicker firing, more sort of raider kind of gun, then the D10-2S is definitely worth your time. The turret that you upgrade to on the T-54 is also excellent. The T-54 mod 1949 is one of the best turrets for any high-tier medium tank in the game I can absolutely think of. It's got 200mm of frontal armour, 160 on the sides and 65 at the rear. But it's all, as you can see in the video here, it's all very much curved around, and the low profile of the tank really accentuates the power of the frontal armour of the turret. And considering how well designed the turrets and frontal hulls of many Russian medium tanks were around the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War were, you can bet your sweet happy that, my god, this tank can really bounce sometimes. Now, I'm not doing too well in these clips. In fact, in these clips in this video, I don't play particularly well. I do apologise for that. That my skill in the tanks in this game, well, it's a bit lacklustre. Let's just leave it at that. To be honest with you, I haven't been playing World of Tanks for quite a while. I don't really think I ever really got into it that much while I was playing Fallout 4 for the first few times, and I do apologise for how lacklustre the quality of my World of Tanks footage has been recently. However, keep in mind I'm getting into it for the first time in a few months, and I am still very rusty. But a couple of the matches I do alright in, like the first match I showed in this episode where I think I did alright against that T-71 and that Tiger 2, and the final match in this episode I also do not too bad, but that's the main general stats of the T-54. There's of course the manoeuvrability and its speed capabilities. Its engine power, its top engine has a weight of 700 horsepower, so it's pretty powerful for its medium. Considering the fact that it has a power to weight ratio of 18.24 horsepower to tons, and I believe that might even be with the stock engine. You can just tell this is a voraciously manoeuvrable tank. It has a great traversal of 46 degrees per second, and speed limit with the, I believe it's the arcade edition, is 56 kilometers an hour. This is a very manoeuvrable and quick tank. It's not got the best acceleration, but then again, that's kind of more of an American tank thing. This vehicle is one of the most manoeuvrable, low mobile and sort of stealthy medium tanks in the entire game. It has a great stealth value, so you can kind of play it as a sniper, although that's not really what it's designed for. It is ultimately designed for mid-range dueling and raiding, so I would outfit it primarily to do those sort of things. So let's say gun traverse, gun lane drive, gun rammer, or crew ventilation, that sort of thing, or maybe even a wet ammo rack, considering the fact that while it isn't lightly armoured, it's still a Russian medium. You're bound to get hit in the ammo rack once or twice. So I would say definitely get the light ammo rack in there if you're someone who gets brawling in there nice and hard and quick and fast. I would personally recommend the crew ventilation, gun laying drive and gun rammer, because it's a quick firing tank, it's got a low profile, and you might use it for close range CQC duels, which is what it is kind of designed for, but it's also, like I said before, very good at mid-range dueling. I should also mention the hull armour as well. Like I said, the hull armour is chips compared to the turret armour. It's 120 at the front, 80 at the sides and 45 at the rear, but as you've probably seen on the front of the tank, it's phenomenally well angled and designed, so you're able to bounce very easily. And considering that it's such a low profile, a lot of the side armour is consistent of tracks, meaning that a lot of the side armour can act as space armour, considering that most of it is, as I said, tracks. This doesn't mean that it's impervious to fire from the sides, and I always recommend you side scope if you're in a brawling situation with this tank. But more often than not, I would recommend using it as a mid-range sniper / raider rather than a straight-up brawler, because like most Russian mediums, it has got excellent frontal armour, but again, it's just not meant for straight-up brawling. I mean, if you want any better example that Russian medium tanks weren't particularly designed for brawling, just look at multiple examples of T-54s imported from Russia to Vietnam, dueling with patterns during the Vietnam War, and you'll see what I mean. Or the example of T-34-76s going toe-to-toe with things like Panthers and Tigers. Admittedly, at close range, the T-34-76 was much more intimidating than those tanks, as they were much more longer-ranged vehicles. But even still, at a distance of, let's say, 100 metres, a Tiger or a Panther is going to slice through a T-34 like a hot knife through melted butter. So, not the greatest hull armour. At the same time, like the turret, it's more than well designed enough that you can bounce a lot of shots if you angle it just right, or if you keep yourself moving and keep running around like a hussar, sort of hitting them hard and fast and raiding and nipping at their heels. So, is there any considerable historical significance to this vehicle? What was its story in real life? Well, the T-54 was one of the most premier tanks that the Russians used during the Cold War. It also had the classification of the T-55 as a later version. Now, in all, this tank commonly weighed 36 tons in most variants, and it was almost 6.5 meters long, so it wasn't a massive tank. It was quite big, of course, but it wasn't like a massive tank like, say, the Patton or the Pershing or even the IS-3, the T-54's younger heavy tank brother. I mean, older heavy tank brother. What am I talking about? Its width, again, was quite reasonable. It was only 3.37 meters, and its height was only 2.4 meters. So, again, like I said, a very low-profile tank, and considering the fact that even with a crew of only 4, that the tank was reportedly very claustrophobic, you can tell that the Russians kind of went for more of a design over comfort aspect on this vehicle, which you can see is the case with a lot of early Cold War era tanks made by the Russians, as compared to those made by the Americans or even the British to some degree, who made a lot of very tough, brutalist designs. The T-54 had an enormous number of tanks built, with estimates going somewhere between 86 and 100,000. This isn't as much, of course, as the T-34, which in all of its variants has recently reached numbers between 90,000 and over 110,000. So the T-34 was slightly more heavily produced. It was, and I think is still, the most heavily produced tank of all time. However, considering that the T-54 was the mainstay of the Russian tank forces during the early Cold War, being designed and manufactured between 1945 and 1958, and then actually being produced from 1946 through to 1983. 1946 to 1981 in Russia itself, 56 to 79 in Poland, and Of course, in the underrated godfather of tank production in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, the tank was produced between 1957 and 1953. So it's not surprising then that this is still one of the top 3 most heavily produced tanks of all time, considering how long it was produced for and how much it was used as a mainstay of Russian and Eastern European tank forces throughout the Second World War. It was widely feared, in fact, that at many points throughout the 30s, the 70s and 80s, that if the Russians had attacked through the gaps in the Berlin Wall, then they would have been able to overrun most of Western Germany within a couple of weeks, considering how many tanks they had and how many troopers they would have coming out of those tanks armed with AK-47s. The Russian army was, by and large, an enormous military machine that could have easily swept over most, if not all, forces in Western Europe through sheer weight of force, considering the fact that even with the number of T-54s they produced, they easily outstripped the number of Shermans that was produced at that point. This isn't a light claim to make. The design, of course, came off the success of the T-34, which is considered by many to be the best tank of all time. The T-44 was produced as an offshoot of the T-34 and was actually produced in small numbers and had around 2,000 made. However, even with the 120mm gun being initially put on it, later being reduced to a more practical 100mm gun, the T-44 wasn't able to take over the legacy of the T-34 as a military mainstay. The reason for this being that even with efforts, to sort of like fit the 100mm gun to the D-44, demonstrated that, little tweaks, and, tinkers with the design would, improve the overall combination. The main issue was always going to be a larger turret ring. This was part of the reason why the T-34-85 variant had such a large turret. It had to fit the 85mm gun on there somewhere that was capable of knocking out the Tiger tank. So despite the lower profile of the T-54, it was designed in mind with a larger turret ring, which is part of the reason why the T-44 was never designed, or produced rather, in considerable numbers. It was too sort of narrow enough to have a small turret ring that it was never really produced in mainstay quantities. The T-54, however, wasn't that produced quickly as first. In fact, at first, only 1,490 modifications were made, which really slowed down production of the tank. And the Red Army in turn received a tank that was superior to World War II designs, and could potentially beat anything on the field of war at that point in time. The first actual sort of serial production design, which was named the T-54-1, differed from the second prototype of the T-54 because it had thicker hull armour and it was also a much more easily producible machine. However, quality problems soon emerged and production was stopped. Ultimately, the model that was settled on was finally the T-54/T-55, which ultimately became the mainstay of Russian tank forces throughout the 50s and 60s, and in turn their Middle Eastern allies in the 70s and 80s and the 60s as well, to some degree. Particularly in Egypt and Lebanon and Syria, these tanks were used to an enormous degree during the Yom Kippur and the Six-Day Wars with Israel. The tanks themselves weren't particularly up to date in the 80s, however they were continually upgraded to be able to compete with the technological capabilities of the American and British tanks of the equivalent at the same time, as Chieftains and latter-day versions of the Patton overtook the older versions of the Patton and the Comet. Ultimately, the T-54 was designed as a mainstay of the Russian tank forces. However, considering it was designed as a medium tank, its aspects of operation was put much more on speed and manoeuvrability, as well as its capability to hold a big gun while sacrificing armour over the much more slower paced tank warfare theories of the Western Allied nations. Now, this could probably be traced back to how the Russians fought with their tanks during the Second World War, in large open formations over open ground, and usually trying their best to keep them away from inner cities, where they would let infantry units dug in with anti-tank weapons and hiding in the rubble, a trick they learned to utilise very much so in Stalingrad, in order to initiate the most painful of military casualties on their enemy when they entered towns, using their tanks as more of an open field cavalry style unit. In turn, they did back up their tank units with a lot of infantry cavalry. And to a degree, the British and the Americans also did this as well. However, it seems like between the balanced combat of the British and American tank forces at a similar period as compared to the massed block formation tank combat of the Germans, it seems like the Russians got the most balanced strategy in between the two, using a lot of mounted infantry on the backs of tanks, armed with powerful close-range weapons in order to support them in hard massed assaults. To a degree, this did work immensely well in the Second World War, when the Russian soldiers were well trained enough. However, of course, as shown by the casualty rates during the Second World War, this was a particularly hodgepodge tactic. It wouldn't always work, and to be fair, the Russians were going up against one of the best organised armies at the time on the Eastern Front. It did work considerably better during the Afghan War of the 1980s, and these strategies were reflected to a very large degree during the final years of the Vietnam War in the early 70s. Not to mention the Yom Kippur War in 1973 between Egypt and Israel and several other Middle Eastern nations. The T-54 by and large was the T-34 of the Cold War. It had to be, as the Russians needed a mainstay tank that was recognisable enough, but also quick and easily usable enough that they could ship it off to their international allies and create an iconic and fearful image of Russian military power in tank combat. This was in large reflected by the amount of success they had with tank combat on the Eastern Front in the Second World War, even despite the heavy casualties he suffered early on in that conflict. By and large, the T-54 was a great reflection of Russian military engineering, and it was more than capable of taking on pretty much anything, even up to the mid-80s. By that point, however, I think it kind of did start to show its age a bit, and since then it's kind of been replaced by more, and I mean more and much more modern versions of vehicles, such as the T-90 MBT, which is a fantastic machine. It probably doesn't have the same iconic status at this point as the T-54 did, and certainly not the T-37. Sorry, my mind is going very sad, but even despite that, it reflects a lot of the T-54's capabilities in that it's a low-profile, dome-turreted medium tank with a powerful, high-velocity, long-barreled gun that is more than capable of duelling at close and medium ranges. Just look at this T-54 lightweight kit, though. Rams into me in the back, knocks me up so far that the enemy can easily just shoot into my ammo rack. Now I do get a little bit angry at him, and I do say to him, watch where you're driving, but I mean, I try not to, swear at him, because that would be somewhat immature. I'm not saying you should abuse people on, well, the tanks. You really shouldn't. Absolutely do not do that. But at the same time, I mean, come on, I was standing still there for at least 5 seconds. The guy clearly was not paying attention. He knocked me so hard that I went up over that mound of earth. and was easily hittable by the enemy in my sight. I just don't understand why people like that are allowed to drive light and removable tanks like the T-54 light one. It just baffles me sometimes. So that's an overall breakdown of the T-54. It is easily one of the most feared tanks in the entire game, and I highly recommend it. I think I'll end it here, and of course, until next time, I'm Gitbag the Great. Have fun with whatever you're doing, don't do anything I wouldn't do, stay safe, and, of course, until next time, I shall see you guys on the battlefield.
Танк уничтожен.